Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you how you can do a night sky watercolor background as part of one of your art journaling pages. So let's get started. So the first thing you're going to do is add frisket to the surface of your watercolor paper. I'm just using a toothpick to just apply little bits of frisket onto my page. So this for me is going to be areas that will be highly concentrated areas of stars. So if you've never used frisket, what frisket basically is a medium that you add so that the watercolor will not absorb on these spots on your paper. But what's nice about it is you can remove it once you have let your watercolor dry, which makes it a really nice medium to work with. It is a little finicky. You definitely want to be careful if you're using a brush with this because it will basically destroy your brush. Often I will use it quickly and then basically wash my brush out with soap and water just to make sure that it doesn't destroy the bristles and make it rock solid. I sometimes also use a dip pen for this, but when I'm doing a small application like this and it doesn't necessarily have to be very specific, I just like to use frisket. And the key to this is just put some random dots on there, kind of like you'd see in a night sky. Again, stars can be very random. And then when you feel like you've had enough stars on your page, just basically let this dry. One thing to be aware of the frisket is it does have a shelf life. That's part of the reason I have a small container of it. My last container of frisket actually went bad, and if it smells bad, it's off. So it shouldn't have any smell to it. It should go on fairly easily and stay fairly liquid. If it's congealed at all, your frisket's done. So something to be aware of when you are buying frisket. Smaller bottles are usually a better idea unless you're doing a lot of watercolor work. So let this dry, and then once it's fully dry, we will start watercoloring on top. So once the frisket is dry, the next thing you want to do is start adding a little bit of water and adding paint to your background. I usually do the whole piece of paper just with water and then add watercolor in it on a wet and wet technique. And actually, before I forget, I should actually have a piece of paper behind. This keeps the other drill pages a little bit cleaner. I know some people don't care, but I generally like to try to keep a little bit of a tidier page. Depending on your watercolor paper may be more absorbent and might be less absorbent. So if the water does not stay on top, depending on the quality of your watercolor paper, the other thing you can do is just work in areas on this instead of just putting down all of your water at the beginning. So I'm just adding areas of just a little bit of color. Grab a little bit of this cat red. This is a really great way where you can start learning just how you want to mix colors together. Just gotta throw some green in because it's fun. Actually, I've been taking some online watercolor courses, and this is iteration of something that I was learning on one of those lessons. Blending watercolors isn't always easy, and sometimes by having these exercises where you basically learn to blend colors together. I've had a watercolor book that had the idea of basically doing patches of color and then mixing the one next to it with a different color and then seeing what happens when the colors bleed together, just so you have a better understanding of how your watercolors work and how they work together on your page. So I'm just going to add in some blue areas. I was using some teal there, a turquoise there. I'm going to be using some cobalt here. I'm going to use this new fun color that I got, this kind of cyan blue, which I really enjoy that kind of color combination. And you're not trying to remove all the color that you've put down, but you're trying to mute it. Because again, a night sky doesn't necessarily have really bright color sections. But the idea is that if you blend these in and you let some of the color pop through as you go, you get some fun variation. And use a little bit more of this ultramarine color. So when those areas kind of pop out, then you're kind of like, oh, okay, there's a fun area in there that has a little bit more variation in color. And so by adding some ultramarine to your palette, and then adding in some of this cad red. Ooh, try not to do that. My cad red's really strong, so I've turned it more into a burgundy here. So I'm going to add in some more of the blue. And I'm just going to pull some color over here. Because what I'm looking for is like a very deep blue. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's actually, this little Payne's gray color, just to give it a little bit more of that deep tone. And now I'm going to add that on top, because what this is going to do is going to give you more of that night sky look. Because that night sky look is quite deep. And by adding that as a wash along this, it ends up giving it a little bit more of the colors that we want in a night sky. But actually add a little bit more ultramarine to that. And I kind of chose the night sky idea because I had some thoughts about how peaceful the sky is and the night sky is, and how much it really gives you those feelings of openness and space and freedom. And just contemplation as well. I do have some pooling on the edges. That's one of the things that you will get if you are working in a journal where it's on a perfectly flat piece of paper and you are not taping the edges. You are going to get a little bit of these bleeds along the bottom and the top. Another thing you can do to try to add variation to this is by dropping in a little bit of clean water. And these are just going to give you little spots. And again, when this dries, you'll notice them as being kind of subtle areas on your layout. And the last thing I'm going to do is add some salt. I did this a few weeks ago on one of my projects. And a night sky, it feels particularly appropriate. I'm going to add some along the bottom because it will do some really neat things with the crystal structure. Seems like it works the best when there's a lot of water on the page in pooled areas. And I'm going to let that sit and dry for a little bit. So once you've actually allowed this to fully dry, the next step is to remove the salt and remove the frisket from the page. So you just basically remove the salt by just gently rubbing with your finger. And just remove it from the page like so. And then with the frisket, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You just use my finger just to peel up by rubbing like this. I know some people say use an eraser. There's more than one way you can do it. I like using my finger because in that way, especially if I'm working on a more fibrous watercolor paper, this way I don't actually end up taking up other things off the page that I would prefer to leave on. And you can see just by doing that, that brings that lovely white color up through the page. Gives you more of that star feeling to the background. Another thing is you don't necessarily have to be doing this as a star background. You can really do this on any sort of project just to add variation in color. You can make shapes. I've done ones with hearts before. There's lots of ways you can do it. It just resists the watercolor, which allows you to end up having a little bit more variation, some more white spots on the page. So you can see in some of these spaces, I actually was using the bloom technique. So that was when I was using my watercolor brush with clean water just to tap water on the page. And you can see, again, it has a different variation of color than the salt does and is different from what the frisket does. So again, you can end up adding texture and layers as you go about it using this type of technique. If you ever run into problems when this dries of it not looking the way you expect it to look, it's much too light, just add another layer of watercolor. It will re-wet, it will mix nicely together, and you can get a more intense color that way. And one thing, you may not be able to see it very well here, but I actually have a little bit of this crystal structure. That comes from the salt. When you add salt to a watercolor page, especially in areas with lots of water, sometimes the salt breaks down and creates this little crystal structure on your page. I like it. If you don't like it, you can either use the salt in areas that are a little less wet, or you can just not use the salt at all. So once you've made this background, I don't like over gilding the lily with these backgrounds. I think they look so nice just on their own. I try not to add too much more to it, but I was thinking about the idea of like the night sky and what it means to me, and I wanted to use this compass symbolism in here. And I'm actually going to use this Dreamweaver stencil silver embossing paste. I've had this for probably 10 years. It still works well, so I'm going to continue using it in my projects. I like using a smaller palette knife for this. It makes it a little bit easier to spread paste. And I'm going to definitely keep this on the thinner side. And so you basically just spread it very, very evenly through the stencil. And this paste is getting older, so I can tell it's not going on nearly as smoothly. A lot of the pastes are like that. A lot of these mediums, they only have so long of a shelf life. The fact that this one is still working really well after 10 years says a lot about the quality of the paste. But it's one of those things of, I try to think about paste of using it within the first year or two of owning it, just so that I don't end up in a situation where it dries out and doesn't really work well with my projects. And I'm just going to leave it to the one symbol. And I like that. I'm just going to leave it at that. And then I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to continue on and add my journaling. So now that this is mostly dry, it's still a bit tacky to the touch. I'm going to try not to disturb it while I work on the rest of the layout. I'm going to start adding my journaling. And if you're new to adding journaling to your pages, one thing that I sometimes like to do is write down my words on pieces of paper and just place them and see how they're going to actually fit on my layout and the size that I think I want to do them at. This way you can figure out which types of letters you want to use, what the layout wants to be, and then this way you make sure that you have enough room for everything that you would like to put on your page. And so that's kind of my plan for this layout. And to try to protect this as it is still a little bit tacky, I'm just throwing a silicone mat over top, but it still lets me to work on this area without disturbing this too much. I have a lot of different jelly pens and a lot of different colors, so I'm going to kind of see what I think might work and go from there. I think in this case, I'm going to try to start with a white, and I'll see how that works. So I'm going to start with using a Jelly Roll size 10 pen. And you can always go over these things more than once if you want deeper letters. My intention is to actually go over this more than once when all is said and done, just to thicken letters and to have it look a little more, have a little bit more presence on the page. So this is what I start by just adding my writing. So I was thinking about the idea of like the night sky, and like when I'm out in the night sky, and especially on a beautiful night, especially a warm night, unlike winter here, what it makes me feel and what nature makes me feel. And so I thought the tranquility of the night sky brings to breathe, rest, pause, the expanse, the openness that brings comfort to my soul. And honestly, it's something that I don't do a lot of, which is relaxing and thinking a lot about how things make me feel. It's actually been part of my art journaling practice, and as I'm going to talk here, I'm just going to start thickening the letters where I can and try to make this a little bit more dynamic than what I have right now. Basically, I feel like a lot of my day job being in a more analytical role, it makes it sometimes hard to switch off and maybe find the tranquility and the quiet that sometimes I really do cherish and the things I really do need. And so I feel like art journaling is a place where we can have these moments of rest, have these moments of feeling connected to things, and having a place to express how we feel. It's also a way to slow down, just to slow down our pace, to kind of see the world as we do. And I used to actually do write poetry and read a lot more poetry, and I've realized the last few years just how little of that I do anymore. And maybe it was actually being in an art journaling class where people were sharing their poetry, and I realized like how odd it felt. Not because of what they were sharing, but just like my mind doesn't really work that way as much anymore. And realizing like there's some real beauty in poetry and in these slower moments where it isn't all analytical. It's not always focusing on what must be done and analyzing information, and instead just really enjoying the process of what our journaling and self-expression can look like. And this watercolor paper seems to be affecting my pens a little bit, so I actually do write a bit on the piece of paper just to try to clear the nibs a little bit. Honestly, I would love to be using paint pens on this. I just have not found a paint pen that really works for me. I'm not sure if it's just the humidity or the lack of humidity where I live. I live in a very dry climate. I find I usually get 1 or 2 uses out of a paint pen before they die. And so I end up usually using more of these gel pens for this type of work. Because I think after spending $30 or $40 on paint pens I got one use out of, I finally gave up. Because I know people who swear by them and say they're wonderful to use, and I just have not had that experience. And this is where maybe I'll go over a couple more times. But again, you can see that by just adding additional gel pen. Again, I could have left it just where it was, but I actually want this to pop a little bit more. And one thing, just so you know, so I'm going to actually move to a different color of pen for some of these words. What I've done with all my Jelly Roll pens is actually create a sample book. I actually have a sample book for all. The sample book is actually for everything that I use: paints and sprays and alcohol inks, a lot of different things. And this allows me to actually get samples put down so I can actually see what they will look like in my book. So I think I'm actually going to move to Jelly Roll Metallic for some of these, because this really nice silver color has like enough shine that it should work quite well in this page. Just so where I'm thickening the letters is I'm thickening some of the letters on the downstroke. And that's why you can very naturally kind of get a stronger look to your lettering. By keeping the upstrokes thin and the downstrokes thicker. So as you can see, when I add some of the sparkle pen on top of the white, it makes it a little bit more contrasty than if you just do it straight on the watercolor. So again, this comes down to personal preference, but whether or not you would prefer to have something that's a little bit more muted versus something that's a little bit more present in this. For others, I'm using the silver pencils to tie into the color of my image. And again, you don't have to go to this much effort. I just prefer a little bit of thicker letters. You could also use stamps for this. There's a lot of other things you could use to do this. I'm just continuing to work on my lettering and this kind of faux calligraphy style to add some of my own flavor to these layouts. So here's the completed project. Again, you don't necessarily have to be putting so much lettering in. There's a lot of different ways you can use this night sky background as part of your art journaling pages. You don't even have to stick with the color scheme that I chose, but just learning through practice how to use your watercolors, how to blend them together to get some interesting combinations can add a lot to your art journaling process. This could also be used really well in a card as well. You could put in your embossed paste image on your night sky. You could use trees. You could try to ground it into more of a skyline type card or journal page. There's a lot of options for where you can take the whole night sky background. And with the lettering on this project, I really wanted to show you how you could use maybe your own just cursive writing, and by making a few changes to it, it can make a really nice lettering style for your journal. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and maybe provide a comment below about what you liked about this video. Also on my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have other watercolor tutorials, other art journaling tutorials, and other ideas on how you can build a creative habit in your own life. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.